Fantasy films in the 80s ran the gamut of brutal sword-swinging action to fantastical magic-filled sorcery, barbarian warriors, and mystical visions. But one movie would combine both of these in a way that would open the floodgates for everyone else and would beat Conan to the punch by a month when it hit screens in April of 1982. That movie would be the first feature film of the late great genre legend Albert Pyun, who would spend his career giving we 80s kids a steady diet of crazy and awesome movies that would greet us at the video store like a familiar buddy every time we'd stalk the aisle for something on Friday night. The Sword and the Sorcerer, and please, don't get that confused with The Sword and the Stone from Disney. That will only end in tears.
Ordained by heaven.
This boy is our king.
Well, by Jove.
Would introduce us to a different sort of fantasy epic, with blood, gore, and more than a little of the horror genre within the swordplay. On this episode of Fantasizing About Fantasy Films, we're going to return to days long past in a time when the world was young and sorcery thrived and wild adventure was forever in the offing, as we part the mist and reveal the Sword and the Sorcerer.
Let's be off. We've a battle in the offing. Kingdoms to save and women to love.
In 1981, Excalibur blew the castle doors open when it came to epic live-action fantasy films that were geared toward an adult audience. You can check out our episode about Excalibur for more info, but needless to say, the movie about the legend is, well, a legend on its own, and film companies were starting the path towards the decade of fantasy flicks we all know and love. During the late 70s and early 80s, Albert Pyun, after moving to Hollywood, California from his home state of Hawaii, had the idea for The Sword and the Sorcerer bouncing around from studio to studio looking for a home for his project. The Sword and the Sorcerer would eventually be distributed by Group 1 International, the same distributor of films like Alligator, The Clonus Horror, and, Threesome, to name a few. Pyun had a grand idea for the story, which took the usual tale of the young prince returning to his father's usurped land and flipping it on its head.
Know you now of days long past, the time when the world was young.
The film begins with the buttery, rich voice of Simon MacCorkindale's Prince Micah. Don't you dare judge me, I love Manimal, and he was the real hero, at least his hand was, of Jaws 3, telling us of times where sorcery thrived and adventure was always in the offing. The intro brings us to a rocky shore covered in fog where King Cromwell and his men, along with a witch, arrive. Cromwell is there to bring back to life Zusha, the sorcerer of the title, to help him win the kingdom of Adon. Cromwell and company head into the tomb of Zusha, where we see a very disturbing sarcophagus. After a hissy fit, the witch does her thing, and the sarcophagus soon turns into an even more disturbing, undulating, bloody mass of screaming faces as Zusha rises from what looks like an unholy melted broth of strawberry jello.
Who art thou?
Titus Cromwell.
Zusha does not look in any way human, and isn't too thrilled with being awakened. He thanks the witch who brought him back by mole-ramming her heart from her chest at a distance to prove to Cromwell and his men that he can do the job. Adon's king is named, of course, Richard. When we first see him, he's standing regally in his flowering orchard, Adon being a land that's prosperous and happy. But he knows Cromwell is battling his way to his door. When his eldest son arrives after fighting against Cromwell and his magic wielder, he dies after warning his father that the army is on its way. Richard decides to go out to battle a final battle, sending his youngest son Talon and his daughter and wife away. He obviously doesn't like his chances. Before they leave his side, Richard gives Talon one of the most badass swords to ever sword in movie history, but I may be partial.
If I die, it will fall upon you to avenge me. Do you understand, Talon?
I understand.
Meanwhile, Cromwell knows he's going to beat Richard handily and realizes he doesn't need a sorcerer anymore, and somehow thinks it's a good idea to literally backstab a guy who looks like this. Zusha, weakened from conjuring, is dispatched by Cromwell. With an unholy scream and cry, he flings himself off a cliff into the ocean. I mean, that's a choice. Cromwell's army handily takes Richards, and Talon witnesses not only his father die, but also sees his mother murdered and his sister taken away. He then gets into a battle with some of Cromwell's soldiers, and we see the triple blade sword in action. And it's awesome. Talon's hand is impaled on a tree, but that doesn't stop him from getting loose and avoiding capture. He disappears, and Cromwell is now king. It's 11 years later when Micah and his sister Alana are planning a rebellion against Cromwell. Cromwell stands in the same orchard that Richard had over a decade prior, and we see the exact opposite of the bounty Richard had. Everything is dead and decaying, and Cromwell isn't looking too great either. You can only have absolute distrust and hatred of everyone for so long before you start to get a case of resting bitch face. Cromwell's brood is interrupted by Michelli, a guy who obviously isn't evil or sneaky in the least. Micah and Alana's plans actually involve Michelli, who appears to be selling out Cromwell. But again, this guy doesn't look shifty at all. Is there such a thing as resting snitch face? I think we discovered it. After being sold out by Michelli, Micah is captured and Alana goes on the run, straight into our hero with a giant meat stick. Talon.
Eat it, pig, or die!
That's a small threat. That's a very small threat.
Talon is only moderately less skeezy than Alana's assailants, but I gotta say, this is a glow up and a half. Talon's become a legendary fighter with a band of warriors loyal to the death for him. Alana makes a bargain with Talon. She'll spend the night, quote unquote, with him in exchange for his sword.
Oh, I can't wait to bed you, wench.
Talon makes no mention of the fact that he's the rightful heir of the throne and appears to have no interest in it at all. But you have to wonder how he just happens to be there at the right time. As the story unfolds, Talon takes down a number of Cromwell's thugs before being captured, as is Alana. In a fairly brutal scene, Talon is crucified at Cromwell's twisted wedding celebration feast as he plans on marrying the princess. But like I said, Talon is a legendary fighter, and the kings and nobles in attendance recognize him. Most of them owe the fact they still have their kingdoms thanks to the warrior, and they decide to help free him. But Talon doesn't really need much help, and he is no stranger to hand injuries. Talon frees his hands from the nails and yells out in epic fashion Cromwell's name. His fighters show up just in time to toss him his giant badass sword, and all hell breaks loose. Cromwell hands off Alana to Michelli to hide her away, and we soon find that Michelli is twice the man we thought him to be as Zusha emerges from his body. Talon arrives, telling Zusha he doesn't have a quarrel with him, until the sorcerer says that Cromwell is his. Then they have a problem. Talon fights both Cromwell and Zusha, eventually stopping them both. He and Alana swing away to cheers in order for him to receive his payment.
Don't we have some business to attend to?
And Micah is crowned king. The film ends with Talon and his band of mercenaries riding off into the promise of more adventures to come. The Sword and the Sorcerer did not have an easy shoot. Pyun had, as a first-time director, not a lot of support or confidence from his producers. There was conflict over decisions and choices of the casting. Tragedy would also strike the set when stuntman Jack Turee was killed while performing a jump and missing his target airbags. Even though the movie gives the film vibe of a European fantasy story that would belong in England, The Sword and the Sorcerer was fully shot in California. Cromwell's castle was actually a shot of a location from Scotland. The cast of The Sword and Sorcerer was an 80s dream. Looking back at it, it's seriously epic on its own. Lee Horsley was Prince Talon grown up. Horsley wasn't the studio's first choice, apparently. They wanted David Hasselhoff, which granted, maybe if it was a musical? But Pyun wanted him and stuck by his guns. Horsley was great as Talon, and this makes sense in a way thanks to a background that included being an outdoorsman and a horse rider. It blew my mind when I discovered that the lusting, animal skin wearing badass from this flick was the same slick mustachioed man in the boots playing Matt Houston only a year later. Horsley is still acting and has appeared in both of Quentin Tarantino's Western epics Django Unchained and The Hateful Eight. I've already mentioned my undying love for Simon MacCorkindale. Not only did the movie have Matt Houston, but Manimal. My Gen X heart was bursting, but we've already had one heart explode already, so let's move on. MacCorkindale wasn't originally to do the narration for the film. This was supposed to be done by legendary actor Oliver Reed, but Reed's also legendary drinking managed to get him dropped from that role as he arrived on the set drunk out of his mind. Pyun went with MacCorkindale, who was already part of the production, and gave great voice. Kathleen Beller, who played Alana, had already appeared in some major films like The Godfather 2 and Fort Apache the Bronx, as well as a ton of television. She ran into some issues during filming with the producers, where Pyun once again stood up for his cast. The producers were pressuring Beller to do her scenes in the nude, and Pyun would not pressure her to do it, instead shooting her clothed. George Maharis, who played Michelli, was a coup of a get. He was in numerous film and TV series, most notably Route 66, as well as an accomplished singer. The Sword and the Sorcerer would be one of the last feature films, though, he'd star in. Interestingly, he'd appear in an episode of Matt Houston in 1984. One familiar face you may recognize as Talon's right-hand barbarian is Joe Regabolto, and I am amused every time I see him in the role. This is because I will always think of him as the nerdy scientist from Street Hawk. Haha! You thought I was going to say Frank Fontana and Murphy Brown, didn't you? It's like you don't know me at all. But yes, he also was Frank Fontana and has a prolific credit list that includes a ton of classic TV. The always amazing Richard Lynch was Cromwell. Lynch was a go-to standard for villains in films, and Cromwell was one of his best. I can't list all the times he would show up in a film and improve it just with a glare. He really is one of the all-time greats. Sadly, Lynch would pass away in 2012 from a heart attack, though he continued working right up until his death. Zusha was played by the awesome Richard Moll. Moll stands at nearly 7 feet tall and was terrifying as the Dark Sorcerer. He'd appear in a number of fantasy films after this one. We'll get to them eventually. But Zusha was one that has probably stuck with me and a number of my fellow 80s children who saw this flick way too young. Moll didn't have the best time during filming, and that was due to the scene that still haunts us all, the crypt scene. Moll had to wear contacts as Zusha, and the goo in the sarcophagus managed to cause them to fuse to his eyes. Moll had to leave filming to have them surgically removed, and that's just about as cringe-inducing as watching the witch lick that stuff off his hand. Speaking of that scene, the crypt and the screaming faces were all designed by the always amazing Chiodo brothers. If you loved Critters or Killer Klowns from Outer Space, you know their work. Even though The Sword and the Sorcerer's budget wasn't massive at $4 million, Pyun and his crew made the most with it. That scene is straight out of a Hellraiser flick and still holds up. Other notable artists who helped create the special effects and makeup in the film would be future Oscar winner Greg Canham and Vi Neil. The Sword and the Sorcerer beat Conan by about 2 weeks, and even with that big of competition, made a killing with $44 million at the box office. This would be one of the biggest successes of Pyun's career, and it would be his first feature film. Many consider it his best film, but there are Cyborg fans who will fight you on that, as well as Dollman groupies. While you might not know it, there were actual toys for The Sword and the Sorcerer, which amused me because this is not the type of movie you would expect coloring books to be made of. But they were, as well as plastic figures of creatures not even in the movie. I'm always constantly amazed by one of the movie posters that was released for the film because it makes no attempt at all to hide how it is trying to recreate Excalibur's poster. Fans continue to love this movie, and more people continue to see it, with more children being scarred for life by it. The story, as I said, is a fantastic spin on the fairy tale Prince Return of the King trope, and part of me always was eked out by the what if Alana was actually Talon's sister and they didn't know it. Boy, wouldn't that be a kick in the head. But that's never mentioned in the film. Maybe I'm just a perv. But then again, so are half the characters in this flick. The long-promised sequel to The Sword and the Sorcerer sort of happened in 2010, with the film Tales of an Ancient Empire. Lee Horsley actually returned as Talon, but he was not the lead. Instead, Kevin Sorbo, alongside Michael Pereira, took the reins. The film was not well received, with a plot involving a vampire queen, a budget that was 1/4 of the originals, and a runtime of around 85 minutes. But even with the issues, you have to respect the fact that Pyun was able to get a sequel he promised nearly 30 years prior made. Albert Pyun passed away in November of 2022. His wife Cynthia had known he was ill and was nearing the end, and had asked for fans to send in their thoughts to Albert so he could see what his work meant to us. Albert's work was to many of us my age, who grew up on a steady diet of video store trips, part of our childhood and adolescence. The Sword and the Sorcerer was the first of many fun and awesome films that I'd watch repeatedly he gave us. It's one of the original 80s fantasy films which inspired this series to happen here at JoBlo. Albert Pyun worked with the passion of loving movies, taking crazy concepts, and finding ways to make them work. Even if the budgets weren't big, his dreams were, and he followed them. And that, my friends, is a lesson to us all. Thanks for the magic, Albert.